Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Berklee Music Education and Special Needs Study Group. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard, the founding managing director of the Berklee Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, and it is a great pleasure to have you with us today to kick off our 2021 study group. With me today are Laura Howe. Laura is our fellow this semester at the Institute, and she is overseeing our digital learning initiatives, and she will be your digital guide today. So she'll be watching the Q&A and the chat and helping you with all of those angles as we go through our afternoon. With us also is our presenter today, Dr. Jennifer Zuk, and we'll be turning things over to her shortly. I have some preliminary information for you, and at the end of the session, we'll have some end of session logistics. Couple of quick announcements right off the top. Yes, you will get copies of the presentations, the slides. You don't need to worry about that. They will be coming to you. On Monday, I'll be sending you an email with the whole group, an email with the videos from both presentations today, all of the slides, and lots of other materials that we'll be talking about later. So no need to worry, the slides will be coming to you. Let me share with you a little bit about me, my work, the Institute, our context for this work today. So rather than reading this very long bit of information, the important things to know are that I sing and play the piano, and that I come to this work from the perspective of access. When I was growing up, the Proposition 2.5 passed in Massachusetts, which is a law that limits the amount of increase in property taxes in any city or town in Massachusetts in a given year to 2.5%. And when that went into effect, all of the arts programs in my public school district were severely cut. And it's only because the teachers taught us on their own time, away from the school building, that we were able to continue our arts education. And I really was inspired by them and that experience, and have devoted my professional life to expanding access to arts and arts education for everyone. The work that I do at Berklee has its roots in Boston Conservatory, where I started in 2004 as the chair of graduate music education. We began working just with people with autism, and have since developed a full-fledged institute working with all different disability populations and all different art forms. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And there's also some lovely visual aids behind me. Our institute is a catalyst for the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in all aspects of visual and performing arts education. Berklee College of Music and Boston Conservatory merged in 2016. We spent the 2016-2017 academic year planning for the Institute, opened our doors September 1st, 2017. It stems from more than 10 years of work at Boston Conservatory. We have three main areas of work. And it's all with this aim of increasing arts education opportunities for everyone. So arts education programs, direct service programs for people with disabilities ages 3 to 93. We service more than 250 families every week. Under pre-COVID conditions, that was in person on Saturdays. We are fully functioning remotely and have been completely remote for almost an entire year, and will probably stay remote through the summer. We offer a wide range of programming, which you'll see in music, dance, and theater. We have the only graduate and undergraduate programs and courses in music education and autism. Autism is our academic focus, though our work extends beyond that. And we have a master's in music and music education with a concentration in music and autism, and a graduate certificate in music education and autism, both programs designed for working teachers. We also do a whole lot of professional development for the field, so that we're looking at the issues around arts education, people with disabilities from multiple perspectives. Direct service for individuals, but also really thinking about current and future educators. This is the list of our arts education program offerings, continually growing. The ukulele ensemble is brand spanking new as of fall 2020, has been very, very successful. And we are piloting a bucket drumming class and a music technology class this semester that we anticipate will continue. And we're working on music theory and ear training and music history as well. We have a wide range of music programs, 2 adaptive dance programs, and a theater program. These are all only for people with disabilities. Then these are the two graduate programs that we offer, the master's degree and the graduate certificate, the only programs of their kind in the world. Classes are in the summers or during the academic year in the evenings to accommodate a teacher's schedule. We've been doing distance learning since before COVID-19 made it necessary. So we have a lot of people who come to Boston in the summer and work with us, but then go back to their home community and teach and take their academic year courses over Zoom as seminars with us. The programs last about 2 years. And we do a whole lot of different professional development initiatives. Our flagship professional development offering every year is our annual conference, which this year is April 10th and 11th and is virtual. The theme of our conference is intersectionality, disability, and arts education. Really exciting program. I will make sure that you all have information for that. We are offering digital learning. We have a resource center that's searchable for teachers. We engage leaders in the field to move the conversation forward. We present, we offer study groups. We do everything we can to provide professional development. We're going to talk about study group logistics after we hear from Dr. Zuk, and I would like to hand things over to her right now. So I will stop my share, and it is such a pleasure to present Dr. Jennifer Zuk to you. Jenny and I go pretty far back to her earlier dissertation days, all the way through her fabulous doctoral process. Jenny has a really eclectic background that I'm sure she'll tell you about, that brings together multiple disciplines in, I think, a very powerful way, and is going to make her already make a phenomenal impact in the field and sets her up to contribute to multiple fields in very meaningful ways. We are fortunate that Jenny is a member of the advisory board for our institute, and she's a treasured colleague, and I'm just so overjoyed that she is here with us today. So Jenny, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. I so appreciate that. Allow me to just set up my screen here. Okay, quick check. Seems everyone can hear me okay, see my slides. Fabulous, that's great. Well, really, thank you so much again, Dr. Bernard, for such a warm welcome, and what an absolute treat to be here with you all this afternoon. I appreciate you joining me from my home today. And while I am sad not to be able to see your faces, I definitely hope to have the opportunity to hear from you as we're able to within the context of this webinar, as I get started today with our topic really focused on neurodiversity and neurodiversity in the music classroom. So I thought it would be nice to start with a general introduction to share a little bit more about myself and what brings me here to discuss this topic with you today. As Dr. Bernard mentioned, my background may seem to be quite distinct in some ways, but I'm excited by how it is that my foundation is really built upon a similar line of training that I imagine the majority of our attendees today share. To share a little bit more about me, I figure in lieu of being able to see each other very well directly right now, I just share a little photo. You can see what I look like. And my undergraduate training actually stems from a guiding fascination, motivation, and interest in the field of music education. So my bachelor's degree was in music education. I studied at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And I will say, while I had been initially drawn to the field of music education with this desire and motivation to really share something that had been so incredibly meaningful to me in my own experiences in grade school and high school, as I found myself studying in college and exploring different topics pertaining to music education, I became especially interested in the field of disability and the role that music can play for children who experience and live with disability. And along the way, I became especially fascinated by how music may have an influence on brain development and thinking about music as one tool that may facilitate cognitive linguistic development and give rise to changes in the brain. And so, as you could maybe start to imagine, while I continue to be just a huge fan and advocate for the field of music education, my motivations led me in quite a different direction in a number of ways. So I really followed this interest in studying the brain, and this led me to pursue cognitive neuroscience research, where I come to you today as one with multiple hats, so to speak. Building on my undergraduate training in music education, I then obtained a master's degree at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, focused on mind, brain, and education. And while in that program, I really explored the extent to which studying the brain can help inform our understanding of child development and to think about what implications neuroscience research could have for how we shape development curriculum as well as elements of clinical practice. So I come to you today as one who has now been deeply invested in the field of developmental cognitive neuroscience for over a decade. And so in my research identity, I have been really interested in relationships between music and language in the brain. And of course, that brings us to a different topic than what I'll be connecting with you on today. But I will say I'm always thrilled to engage on the research side of things and the neuro aspects here, as that may be of interest to you in another context. I also come to you as a clinical speech language pathologist. My doctoral training led me on a path towards a program in speech and hearing sciences. And as you can imagine, with my interest in music and language in the brain, being able to pursue my doctoral training within a speech and hearing program allowed me to really get in-depth research experience and really a foundational set of knowledge in that field. And along the way, I found myself feeling the need to better understand um, truly, what is the typical developmental trajectory of speech and language, and what's the current state of the clinical field in addressing the needs of children with speech and language and communication difficulties. And so that led me to pursue clinical training as a speech language pathologist. And it's been incredibly empowering and rewarding to now be really working at the intersection of the fields of education and clinical speech language pathology and developmental cognitive neuroscience. Whereas I mentioned, these relationships between music and language in the brain are part of my research work. And as a clinician in work that I've done at Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital, I've had the opportunity to explore music-based approaches to facilitating communication abilities with individuals along the lifespan trajectory. And so, bringing this all back to my original motivations to study music education, I am a classically trained flute player. I play the piccolo as well. And I actually really love to sing in a more personal capacity these days. But I am very proud to be a member of the Longwood Symphony Orchestra here in the Boston area. This is a community orchestra comprised of largely medical professionals who at one point in time were very dedicated to their music education and decided to pursue a more medical path in their primary mode of work and vocation. But it's just been incredible to have a musical community and home as I pursue these other directions as a researcher and clinician, that I have this chance to continue to make music and engage with a musical community as well. And one point of pride for me of being a part of this group is that we fundraise all of our concerts for different health organizations in the area. So this has been an exciting intersection of I guess, kind of living on my sense of musical excellence and a mission driven sense of how we can really promote the potential of music and the role that it can have in terms of supporting our well being, both from a health and educational perspective. The other piece that brings me here with you today in particular is along my journey, I continue to really carefully look out for ways that I could continue to contribute very much at the intersection of the fields that I mentioned. And my ongoing relationship with Dr. Bernard has been an irreplaceable opportunity for me to be thinking even beyond the research and clinical work that I do to continue to really carefully and critically ask myself, what is the role of music as a vehicle for access and inclusion for these disability populations that I work with and study and advocate for? And that has been a long, ongoing learning journey for me. And I really would welcome getting to hear about your journeys as well, because I imagine each of us has a story that brings us here today. And if there's one thing I can say, it's to continue to follow that gut feeling and that drive to explore these topics, because this interest in music and disability for me really grew out of some really phenomenal thought processes, discussions, and deep dives with a set of amazing colleagues that's very much been, I guess, building in tandem with study groups such as this that bring us together today. And I share this picture here because this is really a product of this exploration for me that I've been grateful to be a part of. I actively collaborate and contribute to the remarkable work that Dr. Andrew Clark does in the Harvard Music Department. I had the opportunity to be a part of contributing to a new course he developed at Harvard in the last 5 years, focused on music and disability. And actually, the efforts of that course led Dr. Clark to establish a choir that's hosted at Harvard University, but is actually a partnership between Harvard and Lesley University. And this ensemble is called Cambridge Common Voices, CCV. This is a photo of our last concert we were able to have in person before the pandemic. It was our holiday concert in 2020. Or gosh, 2019, December 2019. Wow, to think back on all of that. But I definitely encourage you to learn more about this ensemble as may be of interest. I mention it because this has been a really exciting community that's given us the opportunity to explore the principles and values that we will be discussing today in an ensemble that brings together Harvard undergraduate students and their peers from Lesley University who live with a variety of disabilities. And these are students enrolled in a higher education program known as the Threshold Program at Lesley. And actually, this opportunity to engage in a choir where we are exploring avenues of inclusion through engagement in music has actually served as one of the most irreplaceable learning experiences for myself. And it's been remarkable how our friends and community members at Lesley University have really led the way in teaching us how we can best approach creating a truly inviting, warm, welcoming, inclusive, and accessible musical environment. This is an ongoing learning process for all of us, but I'm very grateful to be a co-facilitator of this ensemble. And what I have to share with you today is very much the guiding, overarching lessons that I've learned to date that have really stuck with me in this exploration that I mentioned of my multiple caps, so to speak, that I bring to you today, my identity as a researcher, clinician, and educator. And I'm very excited to share these lessons learned and these summative values that have been transformative for me in the hopes that this may be a meaningful exploratory starting point for you as you commit to this study group and prepare to take in all that it has to offer. The final piece I should mention here is I'm really focused on different parts of my journey that have led me to be who I am today speaking with you. And I am especially grateful and proud to acknowledge that I am currently an assistant professor at Boston University in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. So my role as educator has definitely taken on a new level. I just started that position this year. It's been a very unique time in the midst of the pandemic to be finding my grounding there. But my role as educator is certainly at a higher education level, one just to acknowledge in our points of connection. So thanks for allowing me to offer you a quite in-depth introduction to me. Um, and I humbly acknowledge who I am and where I've been and kind of where I've come from that brings me here with you today, because we are discussing some really sensitive and incredibly personally meaningful content together as a group today, right? And so I hope to really be able to explore these topics and introduce some ideas and really thoughts for you to be able to reflect on and consider in your own practice and moving forward. And allow me to humbly acknowledge as we get started here that I come to you as someone who is continuing to learn in this regard as well. And I think perhaps maybe that's one of the most important points here for all of us to keep in mind, that there's always room to grow, and with experience comes new perspective. So, with that in mind, setting the stage here, I'd like to pose this initial question. And I'm hoping that those of you who have easy access to the chat may just kind of provide some first thoughts in the chat that we could have a look at collectively together. So I want to just start with a little word association. When you think about the word disability and disability as a label, what comes to mind? Just take a moment and reflect on that. You're welcome to reflect on that for yourself. And like I said, if you feel so inclined to just kind of throw the first words that come to your mind in the chat, that would be great. So just be very brutally honest. What was the first thing you thought of when you think of disability? Oh, this is fabulous. Thank you for dropping thoughts in the chat. Please keep them coming. I'll give you 20 more seconds to add anything more. This is so exciting. Oh, I love the flow. We're flowing. Amazing. Well, feel free to keep adding. This is just wonderful. I am really enjoying seeing this collection of responses we have. Allow me to just read out a few in this list, but I encourage each of you to open up the chat and look at this amazing compilation we have. So, word association. When we think of disability, what comes to mind? Here are some responses I see: challenge, possibilities, no access, such as because of stairs rather than a ramp, limited, unique, IEPs, problem solving, broken, incomplete, exclusion, stigma, not able, sadness, accessibility, little societal support, and then a few kind of double words here, which are fabulous, as well as one comment that's leading us exactly where we're going. There is a response that suggests a preference for neurodiverse as a term, and you have absolutely brought us to the focus of today's meeting. And give me just a few minutes to formally introduce that term for us. That's great. So now, on another note, with this in mind, I am curious to get a sense of your own experience. I'd like to hear just a little bit about how is disability viewed in your classroom? How's disability viewed in your school? And I know that this could be difficult to share only in the chat. So how about this? I'll offer just a minute here, and I encourage each of you to note down these questions, and why don't you just have a little thought reflection on that, whether that be to write something out or just reflect on this set of questions. And if you think that there is a summary that would be appropriate to share in the chat, I'd love to see your thoughts. So just a minute for this. How is disability viewed in your classroom? How's disability viewed in your school? Okay, great. Please do feel free to keep reflecting. I don't mean to interrupt mid-thought. Wonderful to see some summaries coming in the chat. We have one comment, accepted. That's encouraging. Another comment about the school's intervention team, taking the time to get to know students with IEPs. Looks like in this school setting, there are teachers who are strong advocates for the students and develop relationships between students and teachers across the disciplines on the team. Teachers are generally supportive, and when they have questions, they come to us. That's wonderful to hear. How encouraging. Another comment about accommodating physical disabilities, but neurodisability still being viewed as something to be fixed. I look forward to exploring that more in the context of today's discussion. Oh, and Lisa Pierce Goldstein. Hello. My friend and colleague Lisa mentions that the programs at her school are considered an important part of the school and the staff is dedicated. The administration still knows little about disability or special education law, continues to find ways that seem to block or provide barriers to necessary space and resources. Well, that definitely sets the stage for the challenges across the different levels of leadership in the school system. There are so many great comments here. Thank you so much to so many of you for offering your thoughts. Overall, I'm gaining an impression of a lot of encouraging reflections, a lot of reflections on specific aspects of how disability is viewed between the teachers. That seems to be encouraging. But as we just explored, some barriers that present, particularly when it comes to advocating for change at the level of policy or changes within the school system at large. Thank you. I think this is great to be able to set the stage and for me to get a better sense of what brings you here and where you're coming from today on this topic. I'd like to consider some different definitions of disability, and in particular, two primary models of disability. If this is already familiar to you, thank you for your patience as I describe this. Um, and as much as I felt this was familiar to me when I, came across it in my academic studies, I actually find that it has been so important for me to come back to these two models again and again. And oh, yes, Dr. Bernard just mentioned if any of you were in the morning session, then this will be a very recent review. So thank you for embracing another perspective and another take on these models. Um, and I'll share a little bit about how they have continued to be important to me to come back to. But in a first step, we're looking here at the distinction between a medical model for disability as opposed to a social model for disability. So in the medical model, we can really think of this as being kind of the classic way that a medical professional does their job. A medical professional will conduct an evaluation, figure out where any pathology or deficit may be for an individual. And as such, it becomes viewed like a problem to be fixed, right? Now, today we will be carefully critiquing each of these models. And when it comes to thinking about neurodiversity, the neurodiversity movement has very much been a reaction to this medical model and concern for the ways in which it can constrain and limit the way that we view disability and put too much of an emphasis on this notion of a problem that needs to be fixed. Now, it's interesting to think about how challenging it can be to make this distinction between where having a problem to be fixed is important and needs to happen, and where maybe we're kind of over problematizing a situation, right? Because for one example I could offer, I am so thankful that as an individual with vision, with some level of vision loss, my ability to wear contact lenses is so important to my everyday life, right? So, one way to look at this is here's the problem. I can't see clearly without glasses or contacts. And so, the medical solution is here are these contact lenses. To me, having access to those, having the ability to take advantage of that medical offering is so important to me. I wouldn't trade it for anything, right? And so I think it's helpful to really think about where are the benefits of the medical model and where's the necessity, right? Because I sure wouldn't wish for all medical approaches to solving problems to disappear by any means. Where this can become more of a gray point, though, right, is when we think about how we define disability in general. Do we really need to be viewing disability as a problem to be fixed? There are instances where that mindset becomes problematic, right? And so this is where the social model comes in. And yes, we have an excellent contribution from the chat, which I really highly encourage all of you to take advantage of. Like I said, would love to hear from you as much as possible. So please do feel free to continue to make comments in the chat as we proceed. And I'm glad to take moments for discussion or questions or clarification at any point. No need to wait for a certain opportunity. I was going to mention if we kind of think about the benefits of the medical model for just a moment longer here. For me, as a speech language pathologist, it's an interesting point of realization, right? That a good majority of what we do as speech therapists and clinicians would fall under the medical model. We identify where an area of deficit is and create a very specific intervention plan to address that goal, with the goal that we hopefully will ultimately be able to empower an individual with specific tools and skills that minimize barriers to participation and increase their overall ability to engage within their individual preferred environment and way of living. And with that, and thinking about, this necessity of the medical approach in certain contexts, Lisa Pierce Goldstein, one of our attendees, just mentioned how augmentative communication devices are another great example of a positive outcome of the medical model, right? So in the instance of somebody with the inability to verbally communicate, having these alternate means of communication has been incredibly empowering in allowing people to communicate their message and have access to communication, right? Oh, and I suppose, let's see, it looks like there's a comment that perhaps the panelists and attendees, there's a difference in what will be seen only by the panelists as opposed to seen by both panelists and attendees in the chat. So as you offer your comments, perhaps you could just take a quick look in the chat box itself. It'll say to panelists. If you just swap that to panelists and attendees, then everyone will be able to see your response. But I'll do my best to verbally share out anything that I think is appropriate for the whole group to hear as well. Thank you. So this is the medical model, and we see the benefits, but also some of the concerns, right? And that's where the social model of disability really comes in, with a very compelling and valuable point that disability is not so much a medical condition in itself as it often is something that has become a cultural construction. So the question is, what would we identify as being a disability if it weren't for the societal norms and expectations of what it means to be an active participant in the community, and what sort of skills are expected to participate in today's society. And so in that sense, we can really think of the whole notion of disability as a cultural construction and also a personal identity when thinking about this as a point of difference rather than a point of deficit. So the idea with the social model of disability is, let's kind of reframe and rethink here about what sorts of barriers and expectations have been constructed in our society, and where we can rather view disability as a natural form of diversity in the life experience, and recognizing this individual variability that each of us share at different levels. And so an important distinction here in how we view disability and how disability may be addressed is this distinction between, in the medical model, something to be fixed versus the social model being something that we can accommodate, learning to accommodate disability and to really encourage and celebrate optimal outcomes within what an individual brings to the table. And this kind of distinction and recognizing how a difference in attitude and perception can play out in different contexts is very much where I hope we'll go today in our exploration. One advantage to point out right here about the social model is that this really opens up a whole new way of advocating for individuals with disabilities, right? It really emphasizes diminishing a sense of stigma or anything negative associated with disability, and instead really focuses on improving the fit between an individual and the environment that they engage in. And that perhaps we can really look holistically at an individual to explore their profile of relative strengths and weaknesses, and use that as a launching point to consider how the environment can work to fit with what that individual has to offer. As we explore this and the excitement and the huge importance of the social model of disability, I don't want us to forget, though, especially as educators and educational and policy stakeholders in this room, that we recognize the necessity of the medical model for identifying a label, right? A diagnostic label that defines one as having a disability, at least in the current state of practice, right, is a necessary step in order for an individual to receive targeted intervention and specific services that may be helpful in promoting an optimal quality of life. And so I think that there is an interesting challenge for us to be considering here, right? In how we can recognize the values of both the medical and the social model, and to try to avoid becoming ourselves tempted to sit too far on one side or the other of this potential dichotomy. So, for another look at the dichotomy, at the very beginning, someone in the chat had raised this example: disability, thinking of this as somebody with a physical disability who is unable to enter a building because there are only stairs available, and this individual does not mobilize by stairs at baseline. So this says, weigh in, everyone welcome. But we have a problem, right? This is not an accessible mode of entrance for everyone. So, by the medical model, the kind of natural inclination would be to view this as the individual's impairment is the problem, and that with some kind of cure or prosthetics or technological advancements, then this person will be able to go up the stairs and enter this event. Let's fix the problem, right? Whereas then on the other side, the social model of disability, at least in this very simple example and thought process, would say alternatively, hey, the stairs are the problem. They should build a ramp, right? And I think this is a helpful, just very simple first example to recognize these broad differences in viewpoint and just how much we have the opportunity to look at a scenario such as this from multiple perspectives. And today, I really hope that we can all start to really consider the benefits of this social model and how a perspective shift towards thinking about what are the ways that we can modify the environment to become more accommodating and inclusive of different individuals is the direction that I'd hope we can all go in our practice. And so, with that in mind, we talked about the pros of the social model as being this wonderful approach to advocacy, removing stigma, and really improving that fit between the environment and an individual by focusing on their strengths. Whereas the medical model, when we think about the benefits, is a necessary point of obtaining a diagnostic label that can empower one by having the option to gain access to targeted intervention and services that can also ultimately help facilitate positive outcomes. So, to me, after years and years of finding myself swaying on one side of this, to swaying to the total opposite, to just feeling ethically concerned with where I fall on this medical versus social debate, um, I urge us all to consider, how can we view this not as having to choose one side or the other, but how can we really view this along a continuum? Right? How can we, as teachers, as childcare providers, recognize the necessity of providing a diagnostic label in order to gain access to services, but at the same time, how can we draw from the social model of disability to redefine disability, provide necessary and helpful accommodations for our students, and ultimately empower, respect, and celebrate difference over deficit, right? And this is what leads us to neurodiversity as a movement. This topic, this term, neurodiversity, I would be curious to know how many of you are already familiar with this. It seems actually that perhaps many of you are. Feel free to drop me a little thought in the chat about that or your exposure to this term thus far. Um, but for my own just kind of quick, brief impressions and introductions to neurodiversity, this has really been a term coined by a movement, especially among individuals who live with disabilities themselves, in which these individuals have really empowered this notion of disability as a form of diversity. And the idea here is to recognize the individual differences among all of us, right? I can tell you from the neuro perspective, and part of why I think this label has come to start with neuro and this notion of a neuroscience oriented term is actually the very, I guess, striking and true observation that no one brain has the same neuroarchitecture. We think of these developmental milestones and core moments in an individual's brain development that shapes, how we grow and what we're able to do and different developmental milestones. And for me, being so drawn to the field of neuroscience and excited to study the brains of young children, I for sure entered into this field thinking, okay, we do all this research comparing one group to another. So that must mean that individuals with a certain altered neural profile that is associated with any given disability must just be different than a neurotypical control. But the truth of the matter is, even within these groups that we define as either being neurotypical controls or a group with a certain disability, such as developmental dyslexia, which is one topic that I've spent a lot of time studying, the truth of the matter is there is individual variability even within these groups, even among children who are the same age, have the same, reported standardized scores on cognitive, speech, language, literacy abilities. There is just so much individual variability. Now, that has been a really important challenge to the field of neuroscience, and definitely this neurodiversity movement has made for really pushing the field of neuroscience to rethink how these studies are conducted and to recognize the shortcomings of conducting these group level comparisons when there's still so much individual variability even within groups. And one thing that I can say that has been really exciting to me about this movement from a research perspective is actually how we can start to really emphasize these individual differences, recognize them, characterize them, and celebrate individual differences. And I guess then, as a quick kind of follow through, I know I'm not here to speak to you about research today. I'm always glad to talk about that. But just to quickly acknowledge how I see a shift happening both in the field and especially within my own research has been to try to move away from these group comparisons and overgeneralizations to instead looking at abilities along a continuum and looking at the relationship between different skills and abilities and parts of the brain and how these relationships look among individuals. And then to see how these individual relationships tend to look within the group. And so, really, this attention to individual variation and characterizing variability within a group has been an exciting point of transformation in my research work. But this also really is especially relevant to my role as a clinician. And I would hope what you may already be recognizing as your role as an educator in thinking about how we can avoid making overarching assumptions about any given individual child and instead start to think about characterizing and building an individualized profile of strengths and weaknesses. Because the key kind of quote that I've seen with this neurodiversity movement is the notion that each one of us has different strengths and weaknesses, including you. And that really stuck with me. I think that was a real turning point for me to realize that is so true, right? Who are we to think that there's this typical control group that's, got no weaknesses compared to any group that identifies with disability? And that's been not only an important mindset shift for me in humbly approaching my work I do with individuals, but actually, I have found this focus on really characterizing the profile of strengths and weaknesses to be the most exciting and empowering path forward for thinking about how we can tailor individualized instruction for children, as well as individualized intervention that will really both focus on targeting weaknesses that we hope to build and improve in order to empower children, but actually to think about the benefits of also focusing on strengths, right? And how it is that by recognizing individual strengths, we may be able to actually empower children by the strengths they do have and consider the ways in which those strengths can actually be used to bootstrap certain skills that will improve their weaknesses over time. And in that sense, to be sort of thinking about possible protective or compensatory factors that, in the event that a child has a given strength that can be advantageous in a certain setting, how can we really build that up, empower the individual, and let that be a part of carrying them through points of weakness? And so, with this, this really does encompass this very intentional effort to move away from a sense of stigma, right? And to really empower individuals. And just for a quick note on the neurodiversity movement, there are several famous people who have been openly disclosing their label of a disability, particularly among celebrities who identify as being on the autism spectrum or having autism spectrum disorders. And so these prominent figures in the media and various avenues of entertainment are just a few of some of the figures who have been, I guess, really built up with this neurodiversity movement and really thinking about how we have so many prominent figures who have made incredibly important contributions to our society, who, through their strengths, right, have excelled in their areas of interest. And especially these modern day celebrities, some of them have started to speak up more and more about their identity with disability, but actually how they view through a lens of neurodiversity this to be a part of what we might consider normal variation. Who are we to consider that someone needs to be labeled with a given deficit when they have astounding strengths that they contribute to today's society, even while living with disability? And so, I guess just for a quick acknowledgement here, I took these names from a specific website that was really, acknowledging and celebrating celebrities with autism. As you can imagine, this notion that Mozart may have been on the autism spectrum is a bit speculative and derived based on reports and diaries and journals of, how he was viewed behaviorally speaking. That has led to that idea. But Temple Grandin, in particular, is one just especially impactful academic living with autism who has really done remarkable work to advocate for the neurodiversity movement. She's written a book about her own experiences living with autism. And so, if you are interested to really dig into this topic more and to learn about it from the perspective of someone who does live with this experience and promotes neurodiversity, I'd highly recommend giving Temple Grandin a search. She's given a number of really remarkable talks in addition to works, written works that she's produced. And she just has really made an incredible impact speaking to what her experience with disability is like and how that has actually been a part of guiding her on this academic path to getting a PhD and being incredibly successful in contributing to society with this experience. I'm excited to see comments in the chat about music as a superpower for many students. And I'm looking forward to really turning the discussion there soon. So, certainly more to come on that. And perhaps one helpful entry point in starting to reflect on this and consider is I have two questions I'd like to pose for you um, as a way of vision questing, so to speak. I am a huge fan of the vision quest. I don't know about you, but I'd like to offer you, how about 5 minutes to reflect on these two questions I have for you? I think that however this may be most helpful to you is wonderful. I encourage you to think about writing down these questions and then um, just, having a thought bubble and just seeing what sort of free write comes to you in reflecting on these and responding. And just as we did before, if you find there are key elements of what speaks to you, I absolutely welcome your comments and thoughts in the chat. So, my first question for you: how can the principles and values of this neurodiverse perspective be integrated into your teaching philosophy? And with that, how might this guide real world teaching practices? So, please go ahead and take a few minutes and just reflect on what this means to you. And I welcome any of your input in the chat. Allow me to read out the questions one more time. How can the principles and values of a neurodiverse perspective be integrated into your teaching philosophy? And how might this guide real world teaching practices? Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm really enjoying following your reflections that you've shared in the chat, and I hope that you have a helpful separate source of reflecting and tracking this for yourself. Allow me to share a few key reflections provided in the chat, and I encourage you to continue adding, contributing to this. This is wonderful. There's an interesting question raised at the start here of how this may kind of be moving the focus of a teaching philosophy to be more people centered rather than curriculum centered. That could be interesting to consider further. But relatedly, we have a comment about neurodiverse students needing diverse teaching strategies. And I think that the next comment really beautifully ties into that, this idea of really working to have each student who comes to you be recognized as an individual with different interests and needs as a learner and a person, and working to gear lessons to fit their needs, not the other way around. And for sure, a great kind of analogy or metaphor here would be that it's not about fitting a square peg into a round hole. It's about knowing the peg and creating a model that works for them. I also really appreciate this reflection on working to accommodate teaching strategies and aesthetics rather than assimilate this into a different version that makes assumptions about normality. And in so doing, another comment mentioned emphasizes to consider the classroom environment and the content, as well as the delivery and assessment of that content to the educational experiences and how that really can work to include all students. Really nicely said there. And maybe then tying back to how we can kind of think about this dichotomy that was raised of being people centered versus curriculum centered, I appreciate this other reflection, acknowledging the ways in which this philosophy can benefit all students, including but not limited to those with identified disabilities. Ooh, I love that. Yes. And that comment comes from Alyssa Hiltz. Thank you for mentioning this, Alyssa. I will touch upon this a little bit today, but actually, I think you are really um, foreshadowing to where you'll be headed in next week's study group discussion about universal design for learning. And the idea that when we teach with students' unique strengths and weaknesses in mind, everyone in that environment can benefit. I absolutely agree. So there are so many additional comments. This is just wonderful. And it looks like many can be viewed by everyone. I'll just acknowledge a few that may not be viewable all around, with an emphasis on removing barriers and to actually perhaps take a critical look at how traditional approaches to music education may not always be the most inclusive or neurodiverse in nature. It's really interesting, right? And important to consider. For a topic such as music that we view, broadly speaking, as being such an inclusive, inviting environment that can draw everyone in, it's pretty fascinating to really critically consider what music educational practices you may be keeping that are not actually inclusive of all abilities and strength levels. Thank you for that. So I think this might be a great moment to actually allow for a point of break. There's so many fabulous comments still coming in the chat. I'd like to give everyone a chance to be able to read each other's comments and perhaps even respond within the chat, but to also allow just a little breathing room because I know we have quite a lot of time this Saturday afternoon allocated to us. And so it's not a problem for us to just take a little moment to take a stretch, have a restroom break if needed, and actually to continue this reflection. If you would like to continue to consider this, particularly through the lens of thinking about what your goals are for the knowledge you hope to gain by participating in this study group. Like I said, I view today's session very much as kind of building the foundation that I hope will set the stage for the in-depth knowledge you will gain through participating in the weeks ahead. And if I can just set the stage, so to speak, with you today in really offering a few grounding principles and values that I hope you'll keep with you, but to also allow you to recognize where your questions are. Maybe within this vision quest, you see the ideal for how this can be integrated, but are wondering about how to practically implement this goal in your own teaching. That is not so much what my emphasis will be today with you, but that is absolutely what will be covered in subsequent weeks. So, really kind of being able to think critically about what you hope to learn and gain, and perhaps explore for your own project. That's exactly where we would hope you'd be today. So, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break if that sounds suitable. So, I'll plan to pick back up right around 2:25. So please take a little stretch and reflection, and we'll start again at 2:25
Sure.
Eastern Standard Time.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Please take a stretch. Come back at 2:25. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Jenny, I need to restart my computer and come back in. Laura, are you still here? I don't see Laura. Is she still here?
Yes.
Here. Okay. So just keep an eye out for me. I'm going to restart my computer and come back. I'm having a little bit of an issue here. Jenny,
Great.
you're doing great. I'll be back
Thank
in a
you.
moment. I'm going to get out of here and come back.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Looks like if I leave, it says end meeting.
Oh, can
I'm
you
an alternative
assign?
host. Let me make somebody else an alternative host. Laura, for example. What can I do to Laura? I'm making Laura the host, not
Okay.
just the co-host. So Laura, you are now the host. So now I can leave without ending the whole meeting, Yahoo. And I'm going to restart my computer and come back.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks.
I'll be here.
All right, awesome. Let me get myself squared away here.
Okay, I'm just taking note of whether we have everyone back. And as we settle back in, allow me to just highlight a few more comments from the chat. Like I said, I'd love to just go through all of them. Um, but I'd much rather hear it in your voice than mine. So allow me to just paraphrase a few key points made, and I hope that this reflection has been a helpful starting point. There were comments about really keeping in mind a psychodynamic and humanistic perspective, and this strength-based practice has been something that another attendee, I should say, identified as being relevant to both clinical practice and private teaching. It's fascinating to think about what Ginger Kokoska, apologies if I'm not saying your name correctly, had acknowledged about taking on a mentor's role and how that may be a more satisfying way to engage with students rather than maintaining this strict sense of being a supervisor or a teacher. That's pretty fascinating to consider how this mentor-based approach can really inherently involve this sense of discovering individual strengths as one is working through any given weaknesses in order to empower the student and make them more accountable. That's fantastic. Another comment about removing barriers that can keep a student from learning and recognizing actually how music notation itself can be a barrier. It's an excellent point coming in from Bonnie Brown. Thank you for that. This reflection on where in traditional music education practices we may see how those practices are not always themselves the most inclusive is so important and interesting to recognize. And another fascinating comment here from Lisa Pierce Goldstein about the importance of considering infrastructure and how an actual physical space in which education takes place can be really key to this topic. That's very interesting to think about how old a lot of school infrastructure is, and that when there's the opportunity to build new spaces, that in itself can serve as a really important opportunity to build spaces that are more accessible and allow for greater support of neurodiversity. It's very encouraging, and how exciting to think that with new builds, there's this opportunity for growth. Also really appreciate this comment from Monice Reed to consider the needs of all students in the teaching approach that's employed, presenting things a variety of ways, which is totally getting at next week's topic. So nicely done foreshadowing. Once again, you'll be diving into that deeply next week. But an interesting point too about kind of thinking about accommodations that are necessary when working with English language learners, and that many of the tools and strategies you may employ in those contexts actually could be helpful for all children in the room. And that really does get at this notion of how these accommodations or a proactive design may actually allow for creating an environment that will benefit all children. Absolutely. So thank you all for your thoughts on that. This is great. Kind of taking these reflections and now bringing it all together. We started today reflecting on our knee-jerk reaction to disability, right? And how that knee-jerk reaction sometimes inherently involves some level of a negative connotation. Just checking back in the chat to where we started. This knee-jerk reaction to the term or the label disability elicited reflections within our circle such as challenge, limited, exclusion, stigma, not able, sadness, misunderstood, barrier, a lack of support. all of these knee-jerk reactions are totally in line with what we're getting at here. And how can we reframe views on disability to be more centered around diversity, right? How can we seek to redefine disability and define it more holistically? And with that, I know we've already made this point, but just to kind of formally throw it out there and leave it with us, how can we move away from this gut feeling of associating the label of disability with the notion of a deficit? And how can we challenge ourselves to steer away from this perspective and instead really think about disability as difference, disability as diversity, and to actually even consider the ways in which disability may in itself constitute necessary creativity? How about that? This is one of those things that has stuck with me more than maybe anything else that I've encountered in this area of study. And ever since I encountered this view of disability, it made me realize, wow, this is a really exciting opportunity to challenge my own definition of disability and to really think about the ways in which actually disability creates a necessary creativity that can bring diversity to our environment in a way that may be advantageous. And so, through this view of difference rather than deficit, how can we really celebrate the differences that each of us have? Not in spite of, but because of these points of difference, right? And I wanted to just quickly leave a quick note. Apologies. I wanted to just take a moment and note here that this is my recognition of a way that we can approach redefining disability today. Humbly acknowledging that perceptions towards difference and disability are actively changing and evolving and rapidly growing. And as a result, there seems to be frequent modification of language around disability and the way that we offer that label. And so I think that this is a helpful point of consideration for today. And I would hope that all of us can continue to be mindful of the ways in which these labels and views are constantly changing and evolving, and to just be ready to update and modify as is necessary in order to stay up to date, but actually really to let the disability community lead the way here too, right? And another really important point that I really should have put on its own slide, that I'm sure you'll hear from Dr. Bernard and other presenters throughout the study group, is actually in this very topic of consideration. There's been a very high recommendation from the disability community for all of us to go forth with the following notion. From the disability community, individuals say, nothing about us without us. And I think that is a really helpful point of guidance. It is not up to us to study in our ivory tower and figure out what the proper definitions are at different levels, but perhaps, oh, I think perhaps we want to make sure everyone is on mute. I think we're good now, sorry. Great. But in that, to really continue to look to the community, look to individuals in our community who identify as living with disability, and to really stay in tune with their recommendations and follow accordingly, right? But as we work to redefine disability, another excellent perspective I've found to be just very helpful in the guiding philosophy here is to actually really focus on an individual's funds of knowledge and to ask yourself, what do we or what do others bring to the table because of our difference? What do we bring to the table not in spite of living with a disability, but actually because of that lived experience? How can that experience actually really um, give life to the topic of study and the focus and the goals of what's happening in any given community environment? And this notion, funds of knowledge, comes from a highly recommended resource if you are curious to dig into this more and read about it. This is a book entitled Funds of Knowledge: Theorizing Practices in Households, Communities, and Classrooms from Norma Gonzalez, Louis Mall, and Kathy Amonte. And this book really brings forth these guiding questions that I think have value in keeping close to us in the work that we do. The first being, how do all the aspects of our life interconnect and make a person who they are? How does the experience of disability flavor one's academic and social behaviors, abilities, and strategies? That's really key, right? And from there, what lessons, what strengths might one's experience of disability impart? Where might we be able to find these points of strength that can actually further our learning as well as the learning that's taking place within a given environment? And so I do urge you to kind of keep these questions close and to really consider this when working to reframe or redefine your own notions, assumptions, and definitions. And to perhaps consider this book if you're interested to explore that in more depth. So, this sort of brings us now to the topic of educational access and really thinking about what this means for the music classroom, right? So, two questions for you to consider. How do we determine who can have an arts education? And where does this artistic capacity live? Where does it come from? I urge you to reflect on these questions and to think about how your own impression of these questions may be reflected in your own music education experiences, perhaps for the better or for more challenging. And if you have any specific examples that you'd like to share with the group based on your experience, I'd love to hear them. Feel free to add them in the chat. I think that there is this kind of quick first thought that music provides a very unique point of inclusion and access. That's definitely what drew me to the music and disability field and continues to be an avenue of exploration that I find just remarkable meaning. At the same time, the more I've gotten into this field of study, as someone on the outside of being in the front lines in front of the classroom, I've come to realize that there are many children who live with disabilities who do not have an easy time finding their place in the music education classroom. And it's kind of heartbreaking, right? To think about the kids out there with neurodiverse experiences, living with disability, who struggle to feel like they can find a place in their music classroom environments and experiences. And I'll speak to this more in just a little bit, but recent research practitioner partnerships that I've established have led me to realize just how prevalent some really discouraging attitudes towards music education are among children with disabilities who are not having a great experience in their music classroom environment. And so, as we reflect on these questions and ask about where artistic capacity lives and emerges, I actually have a point of insight to share with you that aligns directly with a comment that was just made in the chat. Mrs. Van Els mentioned that everyone should have arts education. No one should be denied. Music education is not for the elite or the right group of people. And a concern that the district may be pulling adaptive music and art and physical education from students who so need it and benefit from it. And actually, I really appreciate that you've raised that point, because in my role as a researcher, a lot of the work that I've done has been to explore the potential benefits of participation in the arts and music education in an effort to really advocate for the value and importance of all children having the right to participate in music. And so, what's interesting about that is while I continue to make these efforts as a researcher and explore how the research I do can help to justify keeping children with disabilities in their arts programs in the general school curricula, we actually have a really important line of justification for this work that has been established by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this was established in 1948. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this, but here's the statement from this Universal Declaration. Everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in its benefits. I have to credit my colleague, Dr. Andrew Clark, for bringing this quote to my attention. And honestly, this has been one of the most pivotal, transformative points of insight that has guided my work and my views on music and disability and access and inclusion. Because how about this, right? I know that so many of us, as a teacher or a stakeholder, or in a point of leadership within the school system, are constantly working to find ways to justify the importance of a child's participation in the arts. But actually, this is a basic human right that has been in effect since 1948. And this still stands, right? I mean, it's crazy to think of how much advocacy continues to be necessary and important, and that we are still fighting a good fight. But actually, the foundation of the value of this effort and this initiative has been established for us for a long time. So I hope that that quote may be a helpful point of justification for you as you look ahead. And when thinking about who you have in your arts education programs, and asking, is this child appropriate for this environment? Who do I wish to have in this environment? I hope that perhaps you can come back to this statement and really critically consider how this applies to your own practice, and perhaps how you can draw from it and learn from it even more going forward. And I know Dr. Bernard already mentioned this, but I will share this slide set after today's session. So no need to be frantically trying to write this down or copy it. I will share the full slide set with you. Allow me to take a moment to just share some interesting points being raised in the chat. There are several here. One practical point of concern that's been raised by Chris Dunnan is that sometimes music classrooms become so large that it's challenging to manage the whole group. and to really tune into the individual needs of individual students. And I'm sure you have raised a point of challenge that many in this space can identify with, and that is one practical barrier to optimal implementation here, right? It kind of brings us back to Lisa Goldman Pierce's point about the need for modifying the infrastructure of how music classrooms are set up and thinking about the ways that actually there needs to be some level of systemic change or changes in the school itself to be more accommodating of these points of success. And Dr. Bernard just mentioned that this will be a big topic of discussion in your groups in upcoming sessions. So thank you for raising that as a spark to be revisited in future weeks. There's another point just about how real this topic is, not only for music education, but arts education in general. Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. And a number of reflections on some of the difficulties of what has changed in light of the pandemic and some concerns for what that will look like getting back to full participation in person. And I appreciate you acknowledging that. I will say that my lecture for you today has very much been constructed in a very optimistic and hopeful view, kind of rising above and beyond the very, very real practical challenges that I know you are courageously and tirelessly facing every day in the current circumstances. Perhaps as we reach the end of our session, we could reflect on that a bit more and learn more about different people's experiences right now. But on another note, when we think about the power that this statement holds for us, this really gives us a very concrete point of evidence to really empower this notion of building a bigger sense of awareness within our communities about how we can really break down stigma and debunk certain assumptions that are made about what disability looks like and what one is capable of or has the right to engage in. And I urge you to think about how could things change if individuals who identify with disability felt empowered and encouraged to participate in these programs freely, to freely participate and enjoy the arts and share in its benefits. And so when we think about where artistic capacity lives, I just wanted to acknowledge this relevant pie chart that really summarizes 3 different aspects of music and the arts, and to just introduce the notion of disability arts to any of you who may not be familiar with this field. Now, I'm no expert, so I really just wanted to introduce this kind of point of distinction as a way of setting the stage for some discussions to come forward in your study group from here, and to also kind of think about the different roles that music can play in intersecting with disability. Because for sure, a lot of our discussion today is really centering around access to the arts, right? In which, in a first step, there is this major effort to consider how those who identify with disability do have access to the arts. And then if we look kind of beyond that at 2 different ways in which that may manifest, there's this notion of art that's made by people with disabilities, but doesn't have any direct connection to their disability. So I imagine this would be one category that would apply for many of us in the room today. But it's neat to also consider the field of disability arts and the very real presence of art that is made by individuals with disabilities based on the disability experience itself. And so there are some really beautiful examples of this out there um, that, of course, may be neat to look into and explore as may be of interest to you, thinking about prominent artists and musicians who do identify with a disability and are creating art based on their own experience. And with that, I have a quote that was shared by a really close colleague of mine, Catherine Branch Lewis, who had done a really beautiful project exploring different people's perspective on disability arts. She acquired this quote from someone in the disability arts community who said, "Disability arts celebrates humanity. Impairments do not disqualify us from that. The human condition is multifaceted, and disability arts is a celebration of that difference." How beautiful is that? I really love it. And so it's interesting, there's really quite a rich history on disability arts, and actually a lot of musical and artistic expressions from individuals with disabilities who are reflecting on their own experiences has been drawn from a notion of art that springs from um, sense a people's sense of oppression, or experiences of frustration with feeling isolated from the ability to participate in the arts in the way that others do. And that's where I really find such value in seeing this positive and hopeful reflection on what the disability arts community is bringing to the arts experience overall. And this movement has very much been fueled by the civil rights movement and directly followed that movement and really gained its first initial attraction in the early 70s. And just a neat little side note that actually VSA itself was founded out of this movement, being established in 1974 by Jean Kennedy Smith. So, a neat little point of gratitude for the history behind this movement and recognizing where it's led us today, and looking at just how fruitful VSA has been, and absolutely pivotal in bringing all of us together today, right? So, bringing this all together now, it's been great to see your reflections on these points already. When we think about disability arts and educational access, I've just provided a few summative points that are really meant to be kind of food for thought for you as you consider what this means for you in your practice. And that would be to think about where the barriers to access may be for individuals who live with disability, right? And in the disability arts space, there's a whole rich set of practices that have been established to really recognize how arts experiences can be more inclusive and accessible. For example, really making an effort to provide audio described performances for those with visual impairments, or providing ASL interpreters, American Sign Language, or sign language in whichever language that may be, interpreters for given arts experiences to be inclusive of those in the deaf community. Thinking about the need for customer service training to better understand disability and what creating an inclusive experience looks like. And I just acknowledge here, kind of thinking about this distinction between art therapy versus art by people with disabilities. This disability arts movement has been very intentionally separate from the field of music therapy or arts therapies. And while that distinction can seem hazy at times, I just think it's a helpful point of recognition to keep in mind that there is this distinction between engaging in arts therapies, where an art form is utilized as one tool to facilitate a given goal area, as opposed to simply allowing for the expression of art by people with disabilities, which gets us more into this disability arts space. I think it's neat, actually, that I had this note about role models, and to think about how that links with a comment that was raised in the chat about the value of taking a mentorship perspective when in this role. That's pretty fascinating, because one thing that I really value and appreciate about the mentorship role myself is this notion that there is an ongoing reciprocity between a mentor and a mentee, right? We start in our early training as a mentee looking to our mentors to teach us how to learn what we want to do. But for me, as I've continued to advance in this academic trajectory and serve as a mentor for others, I realize how important it continues to be for me to have my own mentors who will continue to guide and offer me insight and perspective and help me grow. But I also really deeply value that reciprocity of the mentor-mentee relationship. And so maybe then tying into that comment that was raised in the chat earlier, thinking about what we have to learn from our mentees, right? And if our goal is to recognize that every experience is individualized, in our effort to get to know different individuals and build a comprehensive strength of their profiles of strengths and weaknesses, that perhaps actually there's even more that we have to learn from these people we engage with than we might even realize, that can really help us revolutionize and transform our own teaching practices to do better for different individual experiences. And this is, again, just kind of another point of reflection to leave with you, to really think about what it means to belong to a community, what it means to find community, and to think about the role that you play in cultivating community in whichever environment you may be in, but especially in your own classroom as a teacher. And how can you really set a model for this sense of belonging and how to create a community environment that truly does feel welcoming and receiving of any individual who comes to participate in that environment. And this is where some of the challenges comes into play, right? In recognizing how often there are just too few opportunities for arts education and training for individuals with diverse needs and a diverse profile of strengths and weaknesses, and how we can try to bridge the gap between one's artistic capacity and any physical, cognitive, or social emotional capacities. So, how can we really try to bridge these two perspectives and create educational experiences that will promote a sense of one's artistic capacity, working to accommodate and move beyond possible physical, cognitive, or emotional barriers? And so I acknowledge all of these points, and actually, I humbly serve as the one to raise these points, while then also having to acknowledge the leader of your study group, Dr. Bernard, because her institute and her Saturday day programs for the community have really set a new standard for how to create inclusive music experiences on many of the points that I just mentioned. And with that as well, when considering children with sensory needs or alterations, to really think about how can we make this a new standard of creating a sensory friendly musical environment that will really, you know, I guess just openly cultivate an environment where individuals with different experiences of disability can come and feel included and feel that they are in an environment that has been modified and shaped for them to feel a part of it. And this sense of kind of having a little icon like this that shows up on event flyers and programming, that's been sort of a new notion that's picking up some speed. And Dr. Bernard and her group have really set a new precedent in how to ensure that individuals know in advance of a given event that this will be inviting for them. So I'm excited for all that you have ahead in terms of practical strategies for how to accomplish these goals in what you will be learning from her and her team in this study group. And this finally leads me to a term that's come up again and again now already in our discussion today, universal design for learning. And I don't want to steal the thunder too much on this in today's discussion, because this is exactly the topic that you will be diving into in depth next week in your topic for the study group. And you have a fantastic guest speaker coming to really offer you a fabulous introduction to this concept. And perhaps, oh, apologies, it's in 2 weeks, not next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard, for mentioning that. Perhaps you've encountered this term in your educational training already as well. The idea here is, how can we really carefully consider educational and curricular approaches, strategies, and development in a way that can be designed for all learners, and to be openly mindful of these differences in how an individual may be able to effectively access what it is that you are aiming to introduce them to and invite them to participate in. And coming back to this metaphor that we considered at the beginning of class, thinking about that scenario that was raised of a person in a wheelchair who comes to a set of stairs and is unable to traverse the stairs because they're not accessible to that individual. We reflected on how in the medical model, the idea there would be, well, what problem can we fix to allow this person to be more mobile in order to traverse the stairs? Whereas from the social model, the social perspective, we took this alternate view to say, well, why are there only stairs? Build a ramp. And this visual is one that really has become iconic when thinking about universal design for learning. I love it. It's the both and answer to a lot of the challenges and problems that we've been raising today, right? That there may be this one path, and it may actually seem like the most straightforward, direct, and commonly traversed way of doing things. But how can we expand our perspective to employ a proactive approach to difference rather than a reactive one? So the idea here, right, to kind of take this metaphor even further, would be, rather than just having stairs in this very physical, simplified example, one option is that there are stairs, and that when somebody reaches that point of crossing and they do not take stairs, one option I've seen is when people just kind of throw a ramp over those stairs and say, okay, well, there's our quick solution. Whenever we need it, if that comes up, we just throw that down and then people can get on their way. That would be the reactive approach, right? There's this one way of doing things. And if something comes up that you realize, oh, this is a barrier for this person, okay, I guess I'll just come up with this accommodation in the moment that I need. And that's that. I'd like us to consider, how can we reframe the entire approach, drawing from this principle of universal design for learning, and to think about a model that has been established from the start to proactively accommodate any potential differences rather than react. And I love this kind of visual thought that there are multiple means of access, right? Mrs. Van Els raises an interesting point. Can't we just all use the ramp? Wouldn't that bridge the gap for all? I think that's an excellent question. And I completely understand the question. Thank you for raising it. And I think that is certainly one line of thought and not a bad way to consider things. But the idea with universal design that you'll really get into in more depth in 2 weeks' time is to think about how can we provide multiple means of access, and that through multiple means of expression and comprehension, that hopefully then you are offering more than one possible entry point, and through this proactive approach are allowing the possibility to really include and provide a means of access to individual learners who may have different strategies or different things that speak to them and call out to them and are effective for them. And so I think that this both and approach tends to be um, an approach that I would recommend anyway and stand by. I know there are different philosophies and different ways of approaching this, but the thought of how you can provide multiple means of expression and comprehension will hopefully really enhance the possibility that you are reaching all learners in that environment. And that would be an even better way to go than to try to think of just one strategy that everyone could access. I hope that helps offer my own opinion anyway to that question. And thank you so much for raising it. This could be an interesting moment to hear from you. I'm just curious, maybe real quick in the chat or in your own reflection, that's completely fine. I'm curious to know how many of you are already familiar with this concept and whether you feel this has applied to your own teaching practices to date. Great. So I'm hearing some reflections of familiarity with UDL and already employing the strategy in the classroom. That's wonderful. I know that in practice, sort of like step one is gaining familiarity and comfort with this definition and this topic and this approach in an ideal sense. Then thinking about how this can be practically implemented in your classroom is sometimes where the challenge comes in. So I was just kind of curious to get your own impressions of where you feel you may be in that process. There's a reflection about this boiling down to knowing your students, how they learn, and what may work for them. Absolutely. Another excellent point here raised in the chat is that related services are actually really helpful professions that provide support and to promote access. So that's neat to be thinking about opportunities to connect and communicate with other professional services within your own educational system, and to how to draw upon the strengths that other service providers offer to really bring in as many different points of access and inclusion as possible. Because you're right, it's not always practical to think that the music educator has to take this on their own in complete isolation. A few more reflections in the chat here. about really building up the value of UDL for promoting equity. Thank you for that. And what a fascinating reflection from Catherine Schmidt. Thank you so much on how UDL has challenged her to raise expectations for students, not to focus on what they can't do at the moment, but to provide the right supports that can allow them to have the same access to experiences and learning as their mainstream peers. I really love that reflection on raising expectations for students, and what an excellent reflection of actually promoting equity in the process too, right? It's wonderful to hear so many great reflections on successful implementation of UDL in the past. That's wonderful. Though unfortunate to hear about some instances of curricular changes with new priorities and demands that restrict teaching time and choices. That does sound like a true practical challenge that I hope can be one point of more in-depth discussion in 2 weeks' time when you dig into this topic. Oh, yes, and then just another point of clarification that when we are acknowledging related service providers here, that is, drawing from the speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, vision and hearing specialists, adaptive PE teachers, and music therapists as well. That's great. So, with all of this in mind, I really appreciate you all welcoming my own compilation of key values and perspectives that have been the most insightful guiding points for me. I'd like to turn our final portion. Oh, just a quick check. Can everyone still hear me okay? I see a comment that I might be muted. Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you. Just making sure. Thank you. Oh, hello, everyone. That's so great. Okay. So I think that here I'll pivot and start us on a slow wind down. And I have some topics for reflection that I'd like to bring to you in the final portion of our time together. But as we kind of take everything I've introduced, I hope that you will consider the practice of music as a vehicle for empowerment, reflecting on music's generative role in shaping communities and advancing social justice and human rights. And I've just summarized for you here a little word bubble of the key guiding terms that I feel are the most relevant in bringing together in the context of this discussion. And this kind of overarching look at core terms and values and principles is something that we created over the course of developing this course in music and disability that I mentioned. And I think it's been just a fun kind of point of reference to come back to and to kind of really critically ask, to what extent are these different values and priorities reflected in my own work? To what extent are they reflected in the communities that I engage with and contribute to? And what is it that I am able to do to really bring this forward in a way that is empowering others in the community? And I think overall, I know I've said this several times today, but I think that approaching this work with humility and empathy first is hugely helpful in really staying open minded and being aware of what we have to learn from others, with the ultimate goal to uncover values and attitudes centered around compassion and action that can really enliven your musical community and create meaningful musicking that includes everyone who's there. And so, with all of this in mind, and kind of keeping this at the front of your mind, I'd now like to raise a few questions about views of neurodiversity. We've introduced these topics, we've set the stage, and now I'd just like to raise these questions for you. And given the format of our session today, I think it'd be great to again just give you a few minutes to go through these questions and bring them to your own set of notes that you may have been keeping today. And I'd love to have you take a few minutes and reflect on how these questions feel relevant to you today and your own classroom environment or role as a teacher or educator, whatever that may be. So here are my questions for you to consider. What can students bring to the classroom because of, not in spite of, their disability? How do all these aspects of our lives interconnect and make a person who they are? How does the experience of disability flavor one's academic and social behaviors, abilities, and strategies? And what lessons, what strengths might one's experience of disability impart? So I'll offer us at least 5 minutes here to really individually reflect on these questions and what they mean for you today. As we've done throughout this session, I really enjoy hearing your perspective in the chat. So please feel free to add comments to the chat in response to these prompts, whichever one or few call out to you. And I welcome individual anecdotes, experiences, challenges. Feel free to just drop anything in there. So go ahead and take the next 5 minutes or so and reflect on these questions. May it be a free write session for you to hold on to that actually could be really valuable to then revisit at the end of this study group and see how your responses to these questions may evolve over time. So enjoy this initial intro free write. Thank you for your thoughtful comments in the chat throughout this entire session. That's some neat, just to share a few comments made, some neat reflections about the unique strengths of individuals with disabilities, such as those on the autism spectrum, and a question raised about how much insight chil- children with disabilities bring to the music classroom, and how might we better support them in expressing this point of insight? How can we support students to become advocates for what they need in order to be included, rather than this being exclusively on the teacher to figure out? Really, really great questions. And then on the other side there, to consider what this means for students with complex communication needs. Absolutely. I'll share a comment from Rebecca Adams as well. Students bring individual, different experiences to the classroom, even beyond disabilities. These classrooms are a melting pot of ideas, motivations, and experiences where we would hope everyone feels valued and safe to be who they are. It's neat, as Rebecca says here, to think about the ways in which students with disabilities may bring their own different and distinct way of thinking. And that in that, there's this great opportunity for everyone to have the chance to learn from one another. So embracing these ideas of individualism, meeting each student where they are, then building up from there. I love that. That really resonates with me. And a further comment about bringing kindness and compassion and understanding while still setting high expectations, being willing to adapt and change as needed. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. And that really leads me into my own personal professional anecdote that I wanted to share with you. Because while I myself did not end up working as a music educator on the front lines, as so many of you do directly, beyond my student teaching days, of course, which were a very long time ago now, I am just incredibly grateful for the ways in which I've had the opportunity to partner with different schools as a researcher. And I wanted to just highlight one research practitioner partnership that has been especially meaningful to me. I've had the opportunity to work with the Southport School, an independent school that services children with dyslexia and ADHD in Southport, Connecticut. And this is a school for children who are struggling to receive the level of individualized instruction necessary to meet academic standards in the public school system. So they end up with the opportunity to attend a school such as Southport to get really in-depth, targeted instruction in the area of language, literacy, cognition, and attention. And that once they get this really in-depth, rigorous, individually tailored instruction to get back to grade level, then they can matriculate into the public school again. Now, where my partnership became relevant with this school in particular is, historically speaking, because this is a school that's specifically designed to help kids get back to grade level in their reading, especially, the school historically never really had a music program. And when I first engaged with this school, they had quite a reflection that I acknowledge probably is familiar to many of you as well, in saying, actually, it was raised in the chat earlier today, this notion that if a child is behind in a specific academic area, then there's this pressure to provide them with additional tutoring and individual instruction and services as much as possible to promote that academic area of weakness. And so as a result, the Southport provides really rigorous tutoring in the area of reading, and didn't think that there was a specific reason to prioritize making space for music in the classroom at their school. So I'm deeply thankful to have had the opportunity to have some discussions with the headmaster and the teachers. And this ultimately led us to this partnership that's allowed us to collectively look at the value of what we can take from this ongoing and evolving reciprocity and engagement across research and practice by establishing a partnership such as this. Because I essentially came to this school and shared my own research based evidence for documentation of relationships between music and language and reading in early childhood development. And the school took an interest in my research. And for them, hearing about this research based evidence was the kind of point that was compelling to them enough to consider reframing their approach. And I'm glad to share more about my research in this area as that may be relevant to you. But actually, what's been the most valuable about this effort is that providing research based evidence was the starting point to really push for building music curriculum at the school. And now, what I've been a part of with this group over the past 3 years has been okay, we feel it's important to have a music program, but how does that work? What does that look like? Which has been a really humbling and just incredibly rewarding process to be a part of. Because in a first step, our partnership led the school to identify a way to fit music into the school day without compromising the level of tutoring that these children were receiving. And so it's really exciting to think about the possibilities for this both and approach if the leadership in the school sees the value and is willing to think about how to adjust that infrastructure to make it possible, right? Then in the next step, in the first year that this music program was launched, actually one of the biggest points of challenge for us was realizing just how many of these kids had really poor attitudes towards music, which really is quite heartbreaking, right? To recognize that in this environment that is exclusively children with dyslexia and ADHD who needed this individualized point of instruction to get back on track academically speaking. In addition, I can tell you that sadly, the majority of these children came from a public school environment where they had just been met with a sense that they're not capable of succeeding in the music classroom. They had such poor attitudes and were convinced that they wouldn't be able to do anything that would be raised in this music classroom. And it's just so sad to see how this sensitivity to one's capacity and capability to do well in the music classroom is huge. And so, in my humble perspective here, as a partner working closely with the music teacher in this program, it's been really exciting to see how this music teacher ended up really starting by really focusing on how to establish an attitude shift, a mindset shift. And maybe that's step one. If you're trying to figure out where to start and what to do and how to be more inclusive, is to get to know these kids and figure out their attitudes towards music and how they feel they may have something to contribute, and then to start to explore that. And the only other piece I could speak to here that's been really exciting to see happen in the music classroom at the Southport School is to really, in taking this proactive approach, consider what pedagogical tools are available to you that can promote a sense of fast success. What's a musical experience you can set up that will lead a child to feel they've been successful no matter what they do? So there doesn't have to be this sense of, oh, everyone's doing this one way, but I can't do it like that. So I guess I can't do this, right? And so trying to think of how to get creative maybe by making use of things like a pentatonic scale where anything produced will sound beautiful, right? And seem welcome and inviting, and to kind of look towards those pedagogical strategies that can start from a place of scaffolding that ultimately leads children to have a sense of what they could be capable of, what they could contribute, and then to start building from there. And thank you for letting me share my own experience here. I know there's so much more to say about this, but that's what the future weeks of the study group are specifically focused on. So, my little perspective here, I hope, can just kind of start to light the fire for really practical, in depth discussions to come in future weeks about this. And so, my final set of questions for you as we think about the potential value of this neurodiverse perspective in the music classroom, I want to raise a few more questions for your own reflection that I'd enjoy getting your thoughts on as maybe feasible. But these questions really are: how can music be used as a tool to promote access and inclusion, in addition to being an art form? To what extent may inclusion become a normalizing enterprise, which we've been touching upon a little bit throughout today, right? How can we avoid this? Rather than working to eliminate undesirable behaviors, how can we work to understand those behaviors and why they present? And in this effort, how can we create a learning environment in which all students are, quote unquote, on a level playing field, where no one feels singled out, where individuals are taken seriously, where individuals feel empowered, and where a universal design is in place to accommodate every individual? So feel free to just take a minute or two and reflect on these questions. If there's anything coming to your mind that you feel inclined to share in the chat, I definitely appreciate it. So many wonderful reflections and comments provided in the chat. Thank you all for your active participation and engagement. It's neat to see in this context of neurodiversity in the music classroom comments about how key relationships are to all of this. Yes, we couldn't agree more with that, both myself and Dr. Bernard here. And fascinating to consider the benefits and the potential for using jazz and improvisation strategies in working to create a neurodiverse experience in the classroom. Thank you, Mrs. Van Els. I completely agree. There's a lot of intriguing promise to those approaches and how that can kind of move away from this idea of being totally accurate or not, but to just genuinely participating in music making, right? And that there's no one right way, but to really promote this sense of individual music making. So, with that, I am going to wrap us up. And I really do just have two simple overarching takeaways that I do hope you will keep close to you in your future work within this study group and beyond. And that is really to consider each student individually and to see to what extent you are able to assess individual profiles of strength and weaknesses. And, the extent to which you're able to do that within your own classroom, but to also, as was mentioned by others, call upon your colleagues, call upon those service providers and other teachers in academic areas to kind of build this collective sense, maybe even from the parents as well, right? And to take all the information you can to determine and identify individual needs and to be mindful of those and how you are proactively addressing that within your own teaching practices. And the second here is to really consider the intrinsic value of music. Coming back to that quote I shared with you, to recognize at the forefront of all that we do this basic human right we all have to participate freely in the arts. And so, with that, I'd just like to thank you all once again for your attention and participation and engagement with me via chat in this virtual format. And to again thank Dr. Bernard for this very kind and generous invitation to spend this afternoon with you.
Thank you, Dr. Zuk. What a wonderful way to get us rolling. If I can ask you to stop sharing your screen. What a wonderful way to get us rolling and to get us on a perspective of neurodiversity as the foundation from which we're going to continue our work together. So I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure, as it always is, to collaborate with you and to hear you speak. And your session dovetailed really well with mine in the morning. So if people saw both, there's a lot of mutual reinforcement, which is awesome, and some different perspectives, which is great. In the remaining time we have, we're going to do some logistics. So I am going to share my screen back to our study group logistics moment. Laura, can you give me some signal, maybe even verbally, that this can be seen? The study group logistics slide can be seen?
Yep.
Thank you. So here we are, study group logistics. We're going to go through the logistics of the study group and why did that happen? Okay, there we go. So this is exactly the same information you have in your email. This is the schedule of the synchronous sessions. So today we are at Saturday, March 6th. 2 weeks from now, we will be working in level 1 with Miles Wilcox and Maria Doreste Velasquez on teaching students with disabilities online during COVID-19. They are both alums from our graduate program in music education and autism, and they both teach for the Berklee Institute in our arts education programs. They're extraordinary practitioners. Level 2 in the 1 o'clock time slot, we'll be working with Rhiannon Gutierrez, as we mentioned, on universal design for learning. Rhiannon works in the Boston Public Schools and has worked at CAST, the organization founded by David Rose that explores universal design for learning. She's a phenomenal presenter. And then 2 weeks later, on April 3rd, we'll be looking at multimodal instruction and teaching demonstrations by Nadia Castagna-Morin, who is an alum of our master's program in music education and autism and teaches for us at the Institute, as well as another alum from our master's program, Gretchen Harry, who will be sharing what she has done with drum notation to adapt it for students with disabilities. Really interesting stuff. Then in level 2, we'll be looking at music technology, and at working with students with high support needs. And those two topics will be explored by Tomas Marquez, who is also an alum from our master's program and does teach for us at the Institute. His day job is that he teaches at the May Institute in Randolph, Massachusetts. And then on April 17th, I will spend some time in level 1 about assessment. Okay, we're doing all this great teaching and learning. How do we assess what's happening with our students with disabilities? And then Andrew Clark will be with us. Dr. Zuk mentioned him in her presentation. He is an advisory board member of the Institute. He's the director of choral activities at Harvard, but also works with neurodiverse students in a number of different choral settings, and he will be talking about choral ensembles. And then in the afternoon, in the level 2 session, we'll be looking at adaptive notation and instrumental ensembles with Shana Pistilli, who's an alum from our master's program with the concentration in music and autism, who teaches in Philadelphia. She's done some really interesting work on adaptive notation for instrumental settings and does a lot of instrumental teaching with students that are neurodiverse. And then we go to May 1st, where Victoria Lauriccia, who you saw, or who you're about to see in a video actually, who is a consultant for the Institute, is a faculty member in our master's program, and is also on our advisory board. She'll do 2 topics, differentiated instruction and behavior management. She is a special educator, trained as a musician as well. And then we will look at music learning theory with Krista Yadro, who is one of our consultants at the Institute. And I will be working with folks in level 2 that day on taking special education strategies and translating them into arts education and particularly music education. Then on May 15th, we'll be looking at projects, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And I and Victoria Lauriccia will be responding to folks' projects. So we're going to be recording every session. I will be sending them out no later than the Monday afterwards. There'll be emailed links that you can watch directly through the Zoom system. You will also get the slides. Dr. Zuk is going to send me her slides. I've got my slides from this morning and these slides. They'll all go out to you. In terms of the study group, you can participate in any way that you wish. However, if you want to receive a certificate of participation, you need to meet these requirements. Full participation, which is 18 hours of sessions, 6 3-hour sessions. They can be any combination of level 1, level 2, or a mixture. They can be any combination of synchronous and asynchronous. You can bop back and forth between formats. There also will be a Google document that I will be sending out on Monday for between session engagement, a place for you to reflect on what you've learned today and to think ahead for what we're going to be working on in 2 weeks. And then everyone who wants full participation must also create and present a study group project. We will be sending out certificate of participation probably a few weeks after the full set of sessions has taken place so that the asynchronous folks have extra time to join us. So what is a study group project? A study group project is an application of some aspect of what you will learn in this study group to your own personal situation. Here are some examples. You could do many other things, but here are some examples. You could create curriculum. You could design activities. You could develop modifications or adaptations to existing work that you're doing. You could develop assessments. You could try some new approaches and document what you notice. You could construct a case study of your work with an individual student or with a particular class where you're employing new approaches. The idea here is that we do a lot of classes and workshops as educators, and you learn great stuff, but how do you apply it to your practice? We incorporate this in the projects so that you'll be taking what you learn immediately to a practical application that's personal and meaningful to you. That's why these are only some examples, and you may have other ways that the learning will apply. And it's a bit early yet to know what you might want to do because we haven't really gotten into teaching strategies yet, but you may already be percolating some ideas. So a few other things about projects. Projects are works in progress. We have 12 weeks together. So they are snapshots of what you've done to apply what you're learning here. Nobody is expecting something finished with a neat tied bow. 12 weeks is very little time. You're going to take something, you're going to apply it, you're going to incorporate it and think about it and share with us where the snapshot leaves you. Different projects have different deliverables. What you create to document the project depends on what you're doing. We're going to be presenting the projects on May 15th, both in the morning and the afternoon sessions, thinking Eastern time. The presentations should be brief, less than 10 minutes. They might include short slideshows or videos, an oral presentation, but something quite brief to share what you're doing, because we're going to have a lot of folks to hear from. I and Victoria Lauriccia will be providing feedback to the projects. We will also create a Google Drive folder so that anyone who wishes to share their project with the group can put it in the folder and we can share it out with the whole group. I will also be sharing an email list to all of you so that you can stay in touch with each other and communicate with each other in your own time and on your own space. If you have a project and you are either an asynchronous participant all along or have other commitments on May 15th and can't attend the sessions that day, but you would like your project to be presented, all you need to do is share it with me and I will make sure that it gets shared out on your behalf with the group. So you want to start percolating about the project now. And by that, I mean thinking more about your own practice and the aspects of your own practice that you might be working with. We haven't gotten any real tools yet. We're getting there. Although some of the ideas from today may set you up already to think about some new things you might want to do. I'm going to start a Google Doc that will be shared on Monday for people to put their tentative ideas. We are not married to these ideas. As we learn more, our ideas will take new shape, but probably by the time we hit the beginning of April, we want to be pretty clear on what we are hoping to do for our project, even though it might morph a bit. I just don't want to get someone in a situation where they haven't figured out what they're going to do and it's a week before, right? You want a little time to get some of the work done, and there'll be some tweaking, and that's all good. So I'm going to open it up for questions about these logistics before I share a couple of other quick things with you. I see some things in the chat, so let's go through here. A lot of thanks, which is great. Yes, fantastic. Any questions about the logistics that I just shared? I'll give it a little time. And then I have two cool things to show you before we sign off for the day. I feel like we're good, which is great. So I have two cool things to share with you. The first is a video introduction to our work at the Institute. And the second is a surprise. But let me get to the video. I need to share the right sound, and that's the wrong video. So it's this one. Hopefully we have sound and audio. There are hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities who love the arts and who need to be seen and heard and nurtured and accepted. We believe that arts education opportunities are super important for everybody in their lives.
We've worked with many students that have sung for the first time in our class, have spoken for the first time in our class, have taken first steps in our class. It's been a really rock star journey, I'm not gonna lie.
I have had kids in this class who can't say a word to me, but as soon as the hello song starts, they are matching pitch, they're inserting kids' names that they know. How can I meet those kids where they are by trying to enter their realm?
As parents of a kid with special needs, it's always this stress that they're going to be able to be independent, that they're going to be able to survive. To see that transform in what we see when he's performing, it's like, this is it. This is what really makes him a person.
When we began our work in 2007, we launched just private music lessons with individuals with disabilities, with autism, studying with graduate students from Boston Conservatory who received a lot of training and support. That led to first of their kind graduate programs in music education and autism.
My graduate students have skills that I've never seen in music educators before. They have the ability to create an education in a world for students with special needs and autism that is cutting edge.
By creating an institute, the Berklee Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, it allows us to expand our programs beyond autism to other disabilities, and also to expand our work beyond music to other art forms.
It's been demonstrated scientifically that the arts are good for people. The arts help people do whatever it is they do better. The Institute is a fantastic addition to the work that we do.
This institute is demonstrating that people on the autism spectrum and with other special needs can learn. In doing so, we're often finding unexpected talent.
When Teresa started, she was 9 years old. She wouldn't speak very much. She could play very basic piano melodies, but she had perfect pitch. And now, to see her as a teenager, she'll speak to me in complete sentences, she can answer direct questions, she's able to make eye contact, huge social development.
And no matter how slow the progress is, they keep on believing in the value of that person, regardless of whether they have autism or whatever.
Teaching students on the spectrum is challenging in its own way, but it is so rewarding. Even though they may not pursue it as a career when they get older, I feel like I'm sparking a bit more passion.
I like to sing and act because it's my passion, especially in the recitals.
I still see my son, and then all of a sudden, he's ready for the performance, and then it's like a transformation. He's another person. He doesn't miss a cue, he doesn't miss a note. This is what really drives him.
The arts are an indispensable part of everyone's life. We want participation, we want exposure, we want experience. Berklee provides us with the opportunity to be all of those things in the local, national, and international communities.
I would recommend this program to anyone, even if you don't think that they have a love for the arts. Maybe that's what you need to do as a first step to find out.
You love music, you love the arts, come here. We will embrace you and we will celebrate what you can do. So that video was made in 2017 and has you can see some of the programs that we do and some of the people who you'll meet in future sessions. I want to leave you with a little bit of rock band, because we all should have a little bit of rock band in our lives. So this will be a little bit of a rock band rehearsal. And I will warn you now that this song is a big earworm. So this will probably stay with you for a while, but it will be well worth it if I can move the window down. Here we go. And we're gonna do this. Here we go. I think you get the idea there. Fantastic piece of music and wonderful performances by our students with disabilities. So the question that Emily asked is, we serve all disability populations, not just students who are neurodiverse, but a wide range of impairments, diagnoses, and difference. Thanks for asking. I want to thank all of you for a really fascinating afternoon. Huge thanks again to Dr. Zuk for her phenomenal presentation. We will be sending out, watch for an email from me on Monday, and we will be sending out a lot more material to you then. And we will see you 2 weeks from now on March 20th. There's a morning session, Eastern time, and an afternoon session. You are welcome to either or both. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day and evening. Thanks, everyone.